Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to see how the waveforms from two different sound cards look like in an oscilloscope. So what we are going to do in this video is we are going to use an online tone generator called Zinalski, and it is my favorite one, and we are going to use different waveforms like sine wave, square wave, triangle and sawtooth wave, and we are going to see for each different waveforms how they are compared in two different sound cards at different frequencies, right? So to start off, I'm first going to use the Creative Soundblaster Play 3, which is represented by the blue line in the oscilloscope. And of course this doesn't require that much of introduction because this is quite common and entry level, and a lot of people just use that. And it has like 1900 rupees price point, which is quite nice because for better sound cards it will cost you like 10 times or maybe 50 times, and some of them are actually used by professionals. So this is not really professional sound card, but this will sound quite decent compared to other cheaper ones from maybe China or something like that. And here we have the Maono AU-GM-10 microphone. And don't get me wrong, this is a microphone, but this also has a sound card built into it. So if I check this image, you can see that we have a 3.5 mm audio jack. From there you can get the sound output. So the chipset this is using is not from Maono but from C Media Electronics. So if I open my terminal and run the ls-usb command, you can see that we have here the Maono AU-GM-10, and we have the C Media Electronics driver, C Media Electronics chipset. And for the Creative makes their own chipset, so we are using the Soundblaster Play 3 chipset from Creative. So we are going to use the sound drivers that are provided by our Linux kernel, and I'm currently using the kernel version 6.3.7 compiled by myself actually, but that doesn't matter. The drivers are unaltered and I'm not using any third-party driver. So by the way, let me introduce again that the blue line is for the Soundblaster and the yellow line is from Maono AU-GM-10. So whenever you see some output in the blue line, you have to assume that it is from Maono, and I'm going to say that it is Maono. And for the blue line, I'm going to say that it is Creative Soundblaster Play 3, or sometimes I can call it Creative. Maybe I can call it Soundblaster or sometimes Play 3, it doesn't matter. So this is the Soundblaster and this is the Maono AU-GM-10. So let's play the tones, right? First of all, what we need to do is we need to combine the output of these two sound cards. And to do that, I can use my trusty Pulse Audio PACTL command for the Pulse Audio control. And we can load the module called module combine sync. So what it will do is it will combine all the sound cards into one, and whenever you play the sound or a tone, it will actually play the tone in the two different sound cards or whatever sound cards you have. And to enable that, what you have to do is you have to run that command, and then you have to come here, and I'm using the Pulse Audio extension for XFCE4, and you have to select the combine output. Or what you can do is from the Pulse Audio settings, you can come here and you can select the output device to combine, and that should work. So as you can see that our speaker and the Maono AU-GM-10 has 100% volume set, and here we also have that set to 100% as well. And in our playback, I'm going to play the sound from here, and we have to make sure that there are no other sound sources. Of course, we have some YouTube videos open, but they are not playing. So if they play, we will get some different waveforms in the oscilloscope. So anyway, let's start our tone generator. At 100%, we are currently using sine wave at 10 Hz. So if I play that, you can see right away that the Soundblaster is actually having higher amplitude. That's because I'm using 500 millivolt. If I do the acquire, press the acquire button, it will take some time to adjust the frequencies and stuff. And now you can see that it is actually looking worse. So I have to manually set that. So what I have to do is I can change the vertical scale here to 1 volt for the Maono. And for our Soundblaster, we already have that set to 1 volt. So Soundblaster is of course connected to channel 2. And if we switch to channel 2 and change the vertical position to, channel 2 and the vertical position to 1.3 for example, and for channel 1 we can bring that down to 1.5. So here you can see that the Maono is actually producing higher amplitude, and the peak to peak voltage is 3.880 volt. And for our channel 2 Soundblaster, we also have peak to peak 3.12 volt. So the Maono is actually producing higher output at 10 Hz, right? And you can see that both of them are actually generating 10 Hz, so they are kind of same. So what I will do is I'll sweep it down to 1 Hz and see how it compares. So at 1 Hz, you can see that the Maono is doing something, but the Soundblaster is kind of silent. So if I change the time base to something like doing 200 millisecond, you can see that the Maono is actually working. So the Maono will produce some sound output, but the creative Soundblaster is actually kind of silent here at 1 Hz. So it will actually ramp your subwoofer up and down a little bit, but it is not that like significant to your ears, right? And it kind of makes sense. Sometimes what happens is if you have 1 Hz frequency playing and you are slowly just ramping up and down the subwoofer, what will happen that it is not exactly generating 1 Hz frequency. Sometimes you will hear some crackling noise, and that is because it is not exactly 1 Hz. It is doing a bunch of stuff. So if you turn on and off the woofer really fast, you will hear some crackling noise, right? So in case of the Maono, you will see some jiggling in the woofer, but for the Soundblaster, we will see nothing, absolutely. So if we ramp up the frequency to 2 Hz, now you can see that the Soundblaster activated and it is generating something at least. And at 3 Hz, the amplitude is rising. And as you can see, at 8 Hz, we have significantly better output from the Soundblaster. And at something like 20 Hz, they should produce the similar output, because 20 Hz is audible. It is very low frequency, but you can hear that. And as you can see that the peak to peak voltage is kind of similar. For the Soundblaster, it is 4.08 volt, and for our Maono, it is 4 volt. So the Soundblaster is actually producing 0.8 volt more than the Maono. And at higher frequency, we even have higher amplitude, but for the Maono, it is capped to 4 volts, right? So we are currently at the 50 Hz. And as you can see that the Soundblaster is producing 4.4 volts. For Maono it is 4 volts. And if we keep going up, you can see that we have similar output. So the amplitude doesn't change, but the frequency changes. We are at 1188 Hz. If I press the acquire button again, you can see that the amplitude is similar, but the frequency has changed. And as you can see that for some reason the creative Soundblaster is lagging a little bit, I guess. So it might be leading or lagging, but they are not exactly same. There's like 90 degrees phase difference or some kind of stuff going on in this case. So this is a little bit delayed, or maybe it could be a little bit ahead of the Maono. So if we keep increasing the frequency to something like 4000 Hz. Now if we do the auto mode, you can see that they are quite similar, right? Except the Soundblaster is actually producing more voltage. So if you are plugging in a headphone, you will see or you will hear more sound in the Soundblaster. And if we keep going to something like 8000 Hz, it is kind of same. We don't need to explain that. But surprisingly, if we have crossed something like 19,000 Hz, you can see that for some reason the Maono is not smooth at 19,000 hertz. It is kind of like going up and down a little bit, and it will be worse if we increase that to close to 20,000 hertz, right? Of course, human ears cannot hear this sound at 20,000 hertz, but if you're using this for lab setup or some calibrations kind of stuff, of course this is not the way you want to go. For the Soundblaster, we are actually having 20.16 kilohertz, which is kind of accurate because we are currently generating 20.15 kilohertz. This is accurate, but so this is for the Maono and this is for our Soundblaster. As you can see, the frequency is kind of same, but the peak to peak voltage for the Maono has decreased to 2.08 volts, and sometimes it is ramping up to 3.6 volts. So yeah, you will see some popping or crackling sound because the amplitude is changing a little bit, but not the significant because the frequency is same. So that's one thing you need to note. So yeah, I mean, the Soundblaster is kind of promising at higher frequencies, but at lower frequencies we cannot hear the Soundblaster. Let's add 1 hertz. So now change our frequency to 10 hertz. We are currently at 10 hertz, and let's change that to a square wave. And when it comes to square wave, if I do the auto again, press the auto button, it will take some time because the Soundblaster is doing something very nasty. You will know why. Now you know why. For the square wave, you can see that our Maono AU-GM-10 is kind of generating a square wave. It is not exactly a square wave, but yeah, it is close. But for the Soundblaster, I don't recognize that, right? So this is kind of looking like a noise with some peaks and troughs. So this is quite different from the square wave. So if we keep ramping down our frequency to 1 hertz, now you can see that both our Maono and Soundblaster is kind of looking same. So I have to do that manually. Change our channel because it disabled the channel 1. Now you can see that both of them are having a very difficult time representing the 1 hertz square wave. And if we ramp up to 2 hertz, you can see that the Maono AU-GM-10 is kind of trying to generate a square wave. It is not exactly square wave, but we are close. At higher frequencies though, we are getting close to the square wave. Let me do the echo again. As you can see, that the Maono is close to a square wave, but the Soundblaster is not generating a square wave at all. Now let's ramp up the frequency a little bit. We are currently at 50 hertz, and the Maono is doing a great job representing that. So we are kind of at 50 hertz for both of that, but the Soundblaster is looking like what Maono was doing at 10 hertz. So yeah, that is one thing. So the Maono is more accurate in this case, but the Soundblaster will also sound really terrible, right? And if we keep up increasing the frequency to something like 100 hertz, now you can see that our Maono is generating a clean cut square wave. But for our Soundblaster, we are pretty much close to the square wave. And if we keep up going and going to, let's say, 500 hertz, we are currently at 500, and if I acquire that again, you can see that the Soundblaster is kind of close to a square wave, but we have some peaks at the rising and falling edges. And now what happens if I increase that to something like 2035 hertz? If we have 2035 hertz, you can see that our square wave is distorted a little bit, and we have some kind of like sine waves in between the square wave, right? So let's now increase that to something like 4000 hertz, close to that. Yeah, we are currently at 4021 hertz. If I acquire the meter again, now you can see that the Maono is kind of going to a sine wave, right, instead of a square wave. And if we ramp up the frequency again, now you can see that we have dissolved that square wave into a sine wave. If we acquire that, so as you can see, this is a sine wave, kind of clean cut, and the issue is that this square wave doesn't sound different from a sine wave. So you are actually getting a sine wave at 6997 hertz. And if you keep going up, we are currently at 14,453 hertz. And here you can see that both our sound cards are actually generating sine wave at this point from 6000 hertz. And if we keep going again, now you can see that the amplitude again falls down to something like 1.6 volts for Maono, and for our Soundblaster it is 3.12 volt. So at lower frequencies you have the 3.9 volt, and for the Soundblaster we have 320 millivolts here in this case, because we are actually at lower frequency. Just a second, if I acquire that, now we can represent that correctly. For at let's say 686 hertz, we are kind of getting for the Soundblaster we are getting 4.4 volts peak to peak, and for the Maono we are getting 3.9 volts. But at higher frequencies like 20 kilohertz, we are getting something like 1.6 volts. So from 4 volts at 600 hertz or so, down to 1.6 volts for the Maono. Sometimes it is just going up and down a little bit, increasing the peak to peak voltage. But for our Soundblaster we have 3.2 volts, down from 4.4 volts. So this is for the square wave. If I use a triangle wave at 10 hertz and acquire the meter again, it will take some time because the Soundblaster might be doing something nasty. As you can see that first let me change the voltage level to 1 volt for both the channels. We are at 1 volts, and if I bring the Maono down a little bit and the Soundblaster up a little bit, you can compare that the Soundblaster is rounding off the edges of the sine wave. So the Maono is actually amplifying the signal, but for the Soundblaster it looks like there are some post-processing going on, because it is not a straightforward direct amplification of the signal we are generating from our system. So if we go back to 1 hertz again, you can see that both our meter struggles, and if we change the time base to 200 milliseconds, you can see that the Soundblaster is producing mostly nothing like the other waveforms that we saw before, unlike the square wave, because at square wave it was generating some peak voltages, and that would sound really bad to your ears. Of course, it can rupture your eardrum if you play at a high enough volume. Of course, you don't want to do that. So anyway, now at 2 hertz, you can see that our Maono is also rounding off the edges. It is kind of looking like a shark's tail or something like that. But for the Soundblaster, it is very like random. And if we increase that to 3 hertz, we have the similar situation, but at let's say 5 hertz, the Maono is kind of looking like a triangle wave. It is not there quite yet, but it is kind of looking promising, right? So the auto acquire mode cannot generate that, so we can do that manually, or we can just ramp up the frequency and acquire that again at 10 hertz. At 10 hertz, we have let it acquire. It is taking some more time. So at 10 hertz, you can see that of course we have that kind of issue that we discussed before. But if we keep going up at 20 hertz, you can see that the Soundblaster is kind of from the rounding of edges to it is getting to a straight point where it is generating the triangle wave better. But at let's say something like 30 hertz, we are kind of getting there for a perfect triangle wave. Now you can see that the acquire takes less time. So let's ramp up that to 50 Hertz and see what happens. At 50 Hertz, you can see that the Soundblaster is looking way better than what it was at 10 Hertz, of course, and of course at 20 Hertz. But if you keep going and going, the 50 Hertz will also look bad, because at higher frequencies it will correct itself. Now we are at 100 Hertz, and you can see that we are kind of getting straight triangle waves, right? But at 500 Hertz, let's see what happens. At 500 Hertz, both the Maono and the Soundblaster are kind of looking same. Let's this is actually 564, by the way. Let's ramp it up to something like 2014 Hertz. Okay, let's do that at 2009 Hertz. At 2009 Hertz, we have the similar output. For some reason, again, the creative Soundblaster is kind of leading or lagging, so there's like 90 degrees or so difference between the two. And let's now increase that to something like 4000, and as you can see that it is getting rounded again. The edges are kind of getting rounded, and at 5000 Hertz, we are kind of rounding that. And at 9000 Hertz, we are getting perfect sine wave instead of a triangle wave, and it actually sounds like a sine wave, right? And at something like 20,000, of course, we have the same problem with Maono, where the amplitude is fluctuating a little bit, but for the Soundblaster, we can see that the amplitude has also fallen down to 2.4 volts from 4.4 volts, so that's a 2 volt decrease. Now let's try our sawtooth wave at 1 Hertz. So at 1 Hertz, I have to actually change the time base first to something like 200 millisecond. Now you can see that both of them are having trouble to represent the sawtooth wave, but the Maono is kind of like trying to generate that quite hard. At 2 Hertz, the Maono is looking better, of course. At 3 Hertz, it is the same. Let's now ramp it up to 10 Hertz, and you can see that the Maono is representing the 10 Hertz better than the Soundblaster. So at low frequency, it looks like that the Soundblaster is kind of garbage, right? It is not generating what it is supposed to do. So let's ramp it up to 50 Hertz. Currently we are at 50 Hertz range, and as you can see that both the waveforms look quite similar, except the Soundblaster is still rounding off the edges. It is at 49 Hertz, but let's try that 50 Hertz. So it is not that different. Now let's ramp it up to something like 200 Hertz. At 200 Hertz, you can see that both our Soundblaster and Maono looking kind of same, and they are generating similar output. Now let's ramp it up to something like 2500 Hertz. We are currently at 2508 Hertz, and you can see that our sound has reduced a lot for the Soundblaster, and that is because we are having double the voltage here. So that's a downside of the acquire mode. So what we have to do is we can change the vertical scale to 1 volt, and you can see that they are kind of looking same. And now if I change that to something like 4000 Hertz, you can see that again we have that issue where it is kind of trying to round that off, right? Again, it is 1 volt for channel 1, 2 volt for channel 2, so that's why the amplitude is less. But let's not focus on that. Let's focus on what happens if I just ramp the frequency up. Currently we are at 6410, and you can see they are trying to take the shape of the sine wave, and at even more frequency you can see that at, let's say, something like 9883, we are getting close to a sine wave. And if we change the frequency again to something like 10,000 Hertz, we are currently at 10,000 83, you can see that we are getting close to the sine wave. And if we ramp it up further, we are getting to sine wave directly, straight out sine wave. And at 20,000 Hertz, the amplitude is reduced for both of them, right? So for the Soundblaster, it is kind of gradual. It is slowly reducing, but for the Maono, it is reducing drastically from 19,000 to 20,000 Hertz. So that's what I want to share today with you, but there are some more interesting things to play with. Let's set it to 360 Hertz and let's see what happens if I change my system's volume to 150%. So currently we are at 100%, and from here I can actually change the volume to 150%. And as you can see that the peak to peak voltage or the maximum voltage is not rising. So we are currently at the limit of the sound card. So for some reason, if you have the volume set to, let's say, 50% or maybe 65%, this 150% volume would actually help. So if you bring that down to 100%, you can see that the amplitude is quite low. But if you bring that up to 150%, close to 150%, as you can see, that after getting to the 4.08 or 4.16 volts, the Maono is clamping, and this is true also for our Creative Soundblaster. At 4.5 volts, they will actually clamp their output, so they can't go any farther. It kind of makes sense. You are supplying something like 5 volts to them, and you can't of course get back more than 5 volts because they don't have a boost converter or something like that built into them. So it would be quite interesting if they had that. In that case, at 150% they would produce even more output, but that can damage your speakers and all of that stuff. So currently we are at 4.560 volts or 4.6 volts, something like that. We cannot go any further than that. We can actually increase our sound to 10,000% with our PSETL command, but or maybe I think it was using ALSA mixer or something like that, but we can go beyond 100% and it will actually do nothing. Even if we go to 10,000%, the whole sine wave will translate into a square wave and it will pretty much do nothing. So if we change that back to 100%, as you can see that it is kind of going to a square wave. It is looking like a square wave at that case, because so you are kind of turning off and on the input, and if you are when you are toggling that and you want to generate some triangle wave and you want the maximum voltage, what happens is it will just clamp the output, right? So it is going to generate that kind of square looking wave if you go beyond 150% or something like that. So I hope that was interesting, and let's now try with our sine wave. For the sine wave, as you can see straight away that we have that square looking wave right now, and if we change the volume to 100%, it is a sine wave, and it will go actually to the maximum volume and then it will clamp again. So let's say you have a music or a song that has low volume. What you can do is you can ramp up the volume from 100% to 150% and it will sound perfectly good, because what you are doing is you are increasing the voltage. The sound card is actually increasing the voltage a little bit, but because your song has low voltage, it will not clamp that, right? It can go to 4.6 volts or something like that, and you can hear that with clarity, and there will be no distortion whatsoever. But if you have a song that is in the maximum volume and it is producing the maximum output, in that case it will just distort the output, right? So what is happening here, for example, I just showed you that if you reduce the volume you can get the sine wave, but if you increase that to a certain point, it is not going to increase any further. So this is true for any waveforms. For square wave, of course, this is also true, because at 60%, let's say actually I decrease that to 100%, it is actually a square wave right now, but if we go beyond this level, it is doing pretty much nothing, right? So this is true for every single wave that we have, right? And let's now explore what happens if you do this with EasyEffects sound effect. So we will ramp up the bass or something like that, and we will explore what happens here. So if we open our EasyEffects software, you can see that we have this Firefox running, and the output is combined EasyEffects sync. But there's a problem. So if I go to the effects, we have the bass enhancer, and if I turn it off, you can see that we have pretty much no output. If I turn it on, we still have no output. So we have to sacrifice something. So what we have to do is we have to turn this off, and we can select any sound card, any one sound card. Let's say I use the Maono because the Maono can represent the low frequency better. So I selected the Maono, and we are kind of generating 200 Hertz. Let's bring it down to 100 Hertz and see what happens if we boost the bass. So if I do the auto acquire again, you can see that we have 100 Hertz here, and it is kind of turning off and on, the output looks like. So if we change the time base, yeah, as you can see, sometimes it is silent for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it could be the harmonics. Actually no, because it is not running the software, so that's strange. But let's again auto acquire that, and you can see that when we ramp up the bass, we are actually generating more sine waves, so the amplitude is rising. But again, at some point it is going to distort. So as you can see here, it is distorting, and if we check the auto acquire mode, you can see that it is clearly distorting. If we go to, let's say, something like high dB, you can see that we are actually generating a perfect square wave, and it can no longer represent the sine wave again, right? So if we reduce that down to something like 19 dB, now you can see that we still have some distortion because there are lots of amplification going on from here. But if we reduce that further, the amplitude reduces, but the bass is actually boosted a lot, right? Let's now change that to 200 Hertz or so. We are currently at 200 Hertz, and if I reset that, you can see that if we listen, we have pretty much nothing here because we are currently clamping that to 100 Hertz. So if we change that to 200, now you can see that we are actually generating something. So this is actually giving us the bass that we have, and if we stop listening, we can see that we have increased the bass here. So that is true for most of the stuff. For example, if in case of higher frequencies, if you increase the high frequency, it will of course boost that high frequency. So at 20,000 Hertz, you will see that it is actually increasing that. But for most people, 20,000 Hertz is inaudible, so this software will try to increase the volume from something like 2 kilohertz or so. So if you, for example, open Audacious, you can see that we have 16 kilohertz here. So if you increase the 16 kilohertz, it will actually increase the tweeter sound. So if you have tweeter and then let's say speaker, some kind of like mid-range tweeter or speaker, and then you have a woofer, and then you have a subwoofer, maybe connected to a four-way crossover. In that case, if you increase the 16 kilohertz, it will actually increase the tweeter's output. And if you don't have this kind of tweeter setup, if you have, let's say, two crossover circuits connected to one speaker and one subwoofer, in that case, of course, the speaker will ramp up the 16 kilohertz volume. And in case of sound cards like Creative Soundblaster, it is not a big deal, but as we saw that after 19 kilohertz or maybe 19,500 hertz, we are having trouble for the Maono to generate that waveform. Up to 16 kilohertz, it is perfect because that is still audible and it will really sound sharp and shrill, but the Maono can actually generate that, so it is not a big deal. But above 19,500, of course, it is going to struggle. So these audio software are nothing, but they will just do some Fourier transformation on all of that stuff and just ramp up the voltage up and down to adjust the volume, right? So that's what they effectively do. and I think that was interesting to share. So yeah, that's me talking about different waveforms and how sound are represented in a Linux system. So yeah, that's it. Hope that was interesting, and if you have any suggestion or comments, please leave them down in the comment below so that other people can see and benefit from. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.